Women in Saudi Arabia finally allowed to drive from next year. Is lifting the ban a sign of real reform in the kingdom? Will it speed up friction with a powerful religious establishment? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zeidan. Welcome to the show. Now, it's the only country in the world where women were banned from getting behind the wheel of a car, but not for much longer. Just 9 months to be exact. You see, the King Salman is allowing women to legally drive for the first time from next June. The royal decree removes a cornerstone of Saudi conservatism. Some conservative voices on social media are unhappy, but rights activists are delighted that Saudi women are finally being allowed to do what's entirely normal everywhere else. So will the decree accelerate existing tensions in the kingdom? And is it a major step towards gender equality in a male-dominated society? We'll be discussing that and more in a moment with our panel. But first, Paul Chadajian reports.
Activists like Dr. Madiha Al-Arjoush have been lobbying for decades for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to allow women to drive.
I'm ready, my daughter is ready, and also society is ready. How much longer can we live in an oppressive society that prevents us from our full rights?
By next summer, Dr. Madiha will be allowed to drive without risking arrest, fines, and punishment. The new policy will allow women to obtain a driver's license without having to ask permission of a husband, father, or male guardian. The kingdom's representative to the United Nations talked about the policy during a meeting at the UN.
This is a historic day for Saudi society, for men and women, and we can now say at last.
Saudi Arabia is hoping the policy will help the economy and increase the role of women in the workforce.
As part of the economic reform agenda and the efforts to streamline the amount of money that the state spends on its citizens with diminished oil revenue, the idea of including more women into the labor force would definitely help. And so driving is one mechanism to increase women's economic participation.
Other activists reacted on social media. Manal Al-Sharif is a Saudi women's rights advocate who was arrested for posting a video of herself driving in 2011 to protest the law. In a tweet celebrating the decree, she used the hashtags women to drive and daring to drive. She also said the fight for equality in Saudi Arabia is far from over.
Yeah, I grew up in ultra-conservative society.
The United States also welcomed the move by the kingdom.
Well, then we're happy. We're happy. We're certainly happy to hear that. If Saudi women are now able to drive, certainly here in the United States, we would certainly welcome that. And so I think it's a great step in the right direction for that country.
Another step that's been lauded by rights activists came over the weekend. For the first time, women were allowed to enter the King Fahd Stadium to celebrate the 87th anniversary of the kingdom's foundation.
Saudi women are able to work and to do anything. They're respected and have proven themselves in every field. They're not so weak as to be contained to one place.
The right for women to drive may be a welcomed step, but some human rights organizations say the kingdom has a long way to go in guaranteeing equal rights for not only women, but for minorities like those who are subjected to hate speech and violent attacks. Paul Chadajian, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's get the thoughts of our guests now. Joining us on the panel today is Eylem Atakav, senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia, where she teaches courses on women and film. In Miami, in the USA, we have Saudi activist Yasemin Saib. And in London, Rothna Begum, women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to the show, everyone. If I could start with Yasemin in the USA, in Miami. So women driving sounds like a very normal situation elsewhere in the world, even elsewhere, anywhere in the Muslim world. How much of a big step is this, though, specifically for Saudi Arabia?
I would definitely say that it's a very big step. It's one of the most visible signs of modernization efforts by the Saudi government to date. Even though there have been a lot of other reforms that has been happening in the last 1 or 2 years under King Salman and the Crown Prince himself as well. This is definitely the one that has made global headlines. Rightfully so, because like you said, I mean, Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world where women have, until 2017, been banned from driving. So it's a really big deal.
It's a big deal. Eylem, it's been on the table for a while now. The authorities have always pushed back against attempts to try and change the situation when it came to women being able to drive. What prompted this decision now?
I'm not sure if this decision was prompted at this very moment in time. There might be other ideological and political reasons why it was prompted at this moment in time. But I would like to kind of consider this from an historical point of view. In 2011, as the report suggested, also in 2013, I was teaching in my classes about Saudi women's driving ban. And they were still at the time putting videos of themselves on Twitter, for example, to share their experience of driving as a subversive act. And the images that I've seen today in relation to this particular news item were also the same. They were very much similar to those images. I think it's something that is to do with the concept of change. Change is something that happens very slowly, but it's good that this is happening. Fighting against patriarchy, fighting against male domination, and fighting for women's rights are things that won't change overnight. They will take time, and I think this is just a step forward.
All right, talking about step forward, let's go to Rothna. What practical difference does this make to the lives and the freedom that women enjoy in Saudi Arabia, Rothna?
Saudi women driving is a huge achievement for the women's rights activists in the country who have been fighting for this for more than 2 decades. One of the biggest issues that they've talked about is the reality that they face of not being able to drive. This is a country where public transportation is limited, where to get anywhere around the country, you do need to be able to drive. And of course, that means that you're reliant on your male relatives or male drivers to do so. Now, if you're well off and you are able to have that kind of access, then a male driver is no problem. But for many women, even if they are independent and have the money and the means, they want to be able to go get into a car and drive just like any other man in the kingdom. And for many other women who actually can't afford a driver or who find it very difficult to maintain the lifestyle they have with a driver in place, that can be very difficult. It can be difficult to get a job. It can be difficult to maintain a job if you need to be able to pay your way to get to work on time. So this has been a real impediment for those, particularly in terms of access to employment, but also in situations like domestic violence. If you're being beaten up, how do you get out of the house? How do you get to the police station? If you need to get to the hospital and you need immediate care, you are going to be arrested if you end up in a car and trying to drive yourself there. You will need to find other ways and means to be able to do that. This decision would, if completely allows women with the same access as men to drive, would provide a historic difference to women's lives.
All right, let me jump in on a key word you used there. If it allows completely the same access to drive as it allows to men. Yasemin, there's 9 months to go, and a committee has to study, the decree says, how this is implemented. Is it going to happen? And do you think there's going to be any attempt to push back at it in the next 9 months?
I definitely do think that it's going to happen. When a royal decree is issued of this magnitude, usually, and actually they've even announced it themselves, that the senior scholars in Saudi Arabia have approved it and have seen no objection with Islamic law, as they call it. And so I think that it is going to happen. I'm sure that there are going to be some pushbacks within certain more conservative segments of Saudi society who see this allowance for women to drive as a move towards greater independence for women in Saudi Arabia, which is something that they would object to. And so I definitely do anticipate some resistance from the more conservative sectors of society. But in general, I think that this 9 months is actually a good time to give Saudi society time to sort of digest this. It's been anticipated, 30, 40 years. They've been talking about this. They will have to organize the roads. There's going to be, if you can imagine, a lot more drivers on the roads. They're going to have to issue driver's licenses and driving schools. They have to accommodate to the female population. So I think that there is going to be some procedural and logistic and bureaucratic adjustments that need to happen. But I think most importantly, in the next 9 months, there's going to need to be some education and making awareness in Saudi Arabia with the public that this is actually a very good step for Saudi society, that is really in the interest of Saudi society for women to be able to drive for all the reasons that the other panelists
You mentioned some interesting terms there. Public awareness, education, Eylem. Is this a country that is genuinely right now reforming and expanding the margins of freedom in general? I'm talking about women's issues and beyond.
I think there are lots of other issues that not just Saudi, but many countries have to face with, they're tackling with in terms of gender politics, in terms of women's rights. I do think that there has been a great progress in terms of change within Saudi. I know this from the perspective of films that were made, for example, within the country. The first ever film, for example, was made by a woman, Haifa al-Mansour's film called Wajah, that came out in 2012, in which she kind of depicts those issues around gender segregation, driving ban, and other issues including forced marriage, child brides, and so on. So there are lots of other issues. But I think the key question that I would like to focus on is this idea of the Middle East or the Arab world, or Saudi Arabia in this case, being kind of regarded or talked about or perceived as the backward kind of culture that needs to change. I was really particularly kind of surprised today to see a comment from, as the report suggested, from the United States. One of the governmental departments said, this is a great progress in terms of the right direction. I think we really need to stop for a minute and this kind of think about who decides on what is right and what is wrong, what those cultural values are that makes things right or wrong, and are we really reinforcing by talking about Saudi Arabia or any part of the Arab world or the Middle East in that regard, are we talking about them in a really kind of backlash way that would put or reinforce those stereotypes? Are we recreating those with our language that we use to talk about these progressive elements? The media in general has been not necessarily helpful in representing Saudi in particularly positive ways, but I think this is a big step in terms of
you've come to the right place if you want to have a discussion about how we frame things. I'm so glad you've raised that, but let's perhaps put things into a broader perspective, since that seems to be the way we're going now with this, because allowing women to drive is in line with a broader program called Vision 2030. It's promoted by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It aims to modernize Saudi society. For the first time ever last week, women were allowed into a sports stadium, for example, as part of Saudi National Day celebrations. Now, up to now, sports arenas have been strictly men only. The Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, for example, announced a plan earlier this month to invest in the entertainment sector. Public cinemas are banned in the kingdom. Saudi leaders have confirmed plans to build more resorts and a recreation city dedicated to sports, culture and entertainment. The Crown Prince also launched a crackdown on dissent, though. Social media reports say political rivals, critics, clerics even have fallen victim. The reports say at least 10 scholars were detained, including the popular Salman al-Auda, who has more than 14 million Twitter followers. Let me take that question to Rothna. I mean, while women may be able to drive next year, like I said, social media reports say some pretty prominent figures are being put in jail, even economists like Yasemin Saib for disagreeing with the country's economic reform process. Is there, so, let me put the question again to you. Is this a country that is really reforming, or is this, some see it a cynical PR move?
Well, I'll put it in a slightly different way. When we talk about reform in Saudi Arabia, we have to ask how much are they really reforming? So when we talk about, for instance, just talk about the driving, for instance, they could have said that women are allowed to drive, and tomorrow women are allowed to drive, as in women with international driver's licenses can take to the roads. But instead they said they'll take 30 days to review the decision, and that means they could be spending that time to come up with ways to restrict women's right to drive. And by June 2018, we'll actually see what the reality is like for that reform. But in general, around the country in Saudi Arabia, we know that while Saudi Arabia has always, for the last how many decades, has embraced what we consider to be modern society, technology, and so on, Saudi Arabia has been very embracing of such things. They have at the same time been incredibly repressive. Over the years, we've seen prominent human rights defenders like Mohammed al-Qahtani, like many other human rights defenders who have been arrested, who are now spending 10 to 15 years imprisonment. And in the last year or so, we've seen many more activists, defenders, people on Twitter expressing their peaceful opinion who have been arrested or continue to be harassed and intimidated by the authorities. So while Saudi Arabia does have a Vision 2030, it's talking about reforming the country in a variety of ways. That reform package, that understanding of what reform means, has to be about human rights for all, both men and for women, and designing a package of reforms that actually see that reform come to reality, not ones that actually restrict the reform itself.
Yasemin, you mentioned their pushback from some conservative quarters, and I'm wondering, will this sort of move increase the tensions within Saudi society between the government and some of the conservative quarters?
Well, I think that there's definitely some level of polarization that exists in Saudi society between sort of modern Saudis and traditional Saudis. I think it's very visible even when you are in Jeddah or Riyadh or in more of the inland areas. And so I do anticipate that there will be definite tension, which is why it's very important for the media to play a very important role.
Yes, I mean, just to highlight for our international viewers, give us an idea of what are some of those visible signs that you would see that may perhaps not everyone is aware of in terms of differences between Jeddah and Riyadh, Jeddah being, on the west coast and Riyadh being in the east of Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that generally speaking, I mean, obviously there are conservatives in Jeddah and liberals in Riyadh as well. But if I were to generalize, I would say that Jeddah is known to be more liberal in their lifestyles, and their dressing, the compounds where they host. The lifestyles there are a lot more open, a lot more flexible for families, and as opposed to more traditional lifestyles that where women cover completely, including their faces and their hands, and there's a greater restriction for them to be able to get scholarships and travel abroad freely or study abroad. They don't send their daughters; they get married earlier. So there are many different lifestyle differences, and there is very obvious polarization in the country in terms of lifestyle. So I do anticipate seeing considerable resistance from the more conservative sects of Saudi society, which is why it's really important to spend the next several months educating them on the practical implications of women able to drive and how it will greatly benefit the economy and Saudi society as a whole. There really needs to be a very formal sense of educating the public on why these kinds of reforms are in the best interest of the nation.
Eylem, you mentioned a minute ago we have to be very careful about the sort of terms we use, about what is the right direction. How much consensus then is there within Saudi society about what is the right direction for reform? I mean, some people would prioritize this sort of issue as being one of the top priorities. You read maybe on the Twitter sphere others who would say the priority for reform should really be, allowing people to express themselves regardless of their gender on Twitter, allowing religious scholars or economists to express themselves without fear of imprisonment.
That's true. I think this is an issue about how women's issues, women's rights, have been historically and traditionally used not only within Saudi Arabia, but also globally, as arenas or spaces of political tensions. If we think about, for example, the language that we use when we talk about the nation, we always refer to it as in terms of femininity or womanhood. So, for example, when we say mother tongue or when we say motherland, we're talking about womanhood in different ways. And I think within this context as well, women's rights issues and women themselves are becoming sites to discuss political tensions. So even though there are lots of other things going within the country, for example, political imprisonment, as we have discussed before, I think it is important to acknowledge that these are being discussed in relation to women's issues. So while you are kind of putting the focus, putting the camera on one topic, you're kind of also avoiding other things. So what is being filmed, what is being brought forward is as important as the things that aren't being filmed, aren't being shown. So I think we need to think about that in more careful ways.
All right, and I saw Rothna there in the corner of my eye. You were trying to get in on the discussions here, so let me give you a chance to get in on that.
Sure. I don't think this is one right versus another right. We shouldn't be talking about which one should come first. It's a whole package of human rights that Saudi Arabia should be providing its citizens. And that includes, for instance, freedom of speech, as well as allowing women the whole host of rights that they're currently being denied. Currently, they're still second-class citizens in their own country. So for a long time, because of the fact that protests are banned in the kingdom, you can't organize, you can't have trade unions. It means it's really difficult for Saudi women to organize, to come up and to petition and to start NGOs and so on. Has been very, very difficult for women to get the kinds of achievements they have right now because of those kind of detrimental impacts and violating their rights as a whole in terms of society. But at the same time, by denying women their rights, they're also keeping back society as a whole. So by not allowing women to drive means that they are not able to do a number of things that can contribute to society, including the economy. By also allowing and maintaining the male guardianship system, which means that women cannot undertake certain things like traveling abroad or obtaining a passport without permission of their male guardian, which can be their husband, their father, their brother, or even their son, means that they continue to remain dependent on their male relatives, again creating a lot of problems, whether it's in work, whether it's daily reality and so on, but also keeping back society as a whole in terms of furthering both economy, but also in general the social levels of the community as well.
And a lot of people would, of course, Rothna, agree with that sort of perspective and say all rights need to be tackled at the same time. But my question really was, is that the way it's seen, or how much consensus is there within Saudi society? Yasemin, you're a Saudi, you're a woman, you're an activist. I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I mean, when you look at the top 4 Twitter accounts, for example, in terms of followers in Saudi Arabia, they're accounts of religious scholars and figures mostly. Does it say something about sort of the direction that many, if not most, Saudis want their country to go in? Do we really have an idea about what reform means to most Saudis?
Okay, I'm glad you posted that question, Sami, because you see, I see this as, like the starfish story, where, this child was picking up a starfish, throwing it in the water, and then this guy came and said, well, what about all the thousands of other starfishes that are washed up ashore? Said, well, it matters to this one. I think the point that story is really relevant here is because when we talk about, when women, or in this case particularly lifting of the ban for women to drive, or the ability for women to travel, or all the other numerous major step reforms that have happened in the last few years in Saudi Arabia, particularly impacting women, we need to sort of stop for a second and be able to applaud that, and not necessarily say, well, if one reform happens, then all reform has to happen at that time, at that place, within the same juncture. Yes, of course, all of the other restrictions that are still there in Saudi Arabia that are imposed, whether it's politically or otherwise, needs to happen, over time. But I don't want to also discount
what has been achieved already
that have been made.
Right. Okay. I'm afraid we're going to have to.
So it's not an all or nothing.
Right. All right. Let's end it on that point then. It's not all or nothing. It rarely is in life. But thanks to our guests, because we are out of time. Yasemin Saib there, and Rothna Begum and of course, Eylem, Atakav. Thank you all for joining us. You can see the show again too anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.